For many, Mabel Greer's Toy Shop will be a name that's associated very much with the start of Yes. In fact, the name Mabel Greer's Toy Shop was the name of the band that became Yes eventually. But going right the way back, well, a good 2 years before Yes formed, there was a band formed by Clive Bailey and Bob Hagger. And that band was Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. They have a new album out at the moment. It does have a Yes connection, which we'll get to in a second. But the album is called New Way of Life. And I have on the other end of a telephone line founder member and drummer Bob Hagger. Bob, good to speak to you.
Hey there, John. How are you?
I'm fine. Bet you never thought you'd actually be talking about an album some sort of 48, 49 years after the event, did you?
Well, it is a bit of a surprise. I think, the album itself is a miracle in the making.
There's talk that people are saying this is almost a record good enough for the Guinness Book of World Records in that this is the longest time between a band forming and their debut album coming out.
Well, it could well be. I think I haven't heard of anything else like this happening. I mean, the story is quite amazing. If you can imagine sitting down with a musician 45 years after seeing him, and then playing the same music, it really is a miracle.
We're talking a little bit before we started this interview, and I said, I obviously am very aware of Yes and the sort of origins of Yes, and this album sounds very like the way I imagined Mabel Greer's Toy Shop to sound, except it's been dragged into the 21st century, which of course is obviously the way it has to be, because I think to be the way you were, well, it's impossible. You're not the people you were then.
Well, that's true. But when you consider that the album had no preparation whatsoever, it almost started out as a joke when Clive and I met up and we said, let's do a jam session, let's see what it sounds like. We sat down and ended up playing the same thing as we did all those years ago. It is quite amazing. I think that in the old days, the music was a lot more psychedelic and maybe a lot less structured than we've managed to do for the album. I think Clive has developed over the years much more as a composer and an arranger compared to, the raw musicians that we were in those days. Mm-hmm. So it is different. It's, as you say, it's got the old stuff in it, but it's developed and grown with time.
I think it's fair to say, looking back over the history of Mabel Greer's Toy Shop, which, I mean, it was only a short period of time playing gigs in and around London, but there seemed to be an awful lot of comings and goings of various members at the time. Do you think that possibly stalled any potential success that Mabel Greer's Toy Shop had at the time?
Yeah, it did. There wasn't, the consistency that you would require when you imagine that Peter Banks, in that short time, played for us twice.
Yes.
He joined straight after Chris joined us. And, we had maybe 2 or 3 months like that, maybe 4 months, 5 months max. And then he went off, I think he went off to join a band called The Neat Change or something at the time.
That's right, he did.
And that didn't work out for him, so he came back. So, yeah, we were missing that consistency that you really do need. Playing every night is what develops the band.
It seems to me, again, looking at some of the available dates that are around for Mabel Greer's Toy Shop at the time, and I don't think Mabel Greer's Toy Shop were any different from a lot of bands at that point. The Marquee seemed to be the centre of your universe.
I think it was, it felt like the centre of the universe. There were 2 places that felt like the centre, I think. There was Marquee and Middle-earth, mm-hmm. and then associated to that you had Happening 44, UFO. But I think we probably did more colleges than anything else. From going back in, getting the memory cells working again, I remember sitting more in colleges than we did in the clubs.
Let's look at the current lineup of the band. There's obviously yourself and there's Clive Bailey in there, the 2 founder members. You've also got 2 members of Yes, Tony Kaye, or former members of Yes, I should say, Tony Kaye and Billy Sherwood. And you've also got Hugo Barr in there. How did that particular lineup come together? I believe that Hugo played a big part in the early days of you 2 guys sort of playing together again.
Yeah, and he still does. We had a good rehearsal session last week. We spent the whole week in rehearsal, and Hugo was there and played a big part, as he does. He pulled it together, I think, from the beginning when Clive and I sat down and started jamming this old stuff. Hugo, as a professional musician today, brought the consistency and stability to what we were doing. So Hugo's had a huge influence on us. And Alex Kerran, too, who engineered our album, mm-hmm. has also been playing with us live, because on the album, I don't know if anybody's mentioned this, but all of the guitar parts, and there are a lot of guitar parts on that album, they were all played by Clive. The leads, the rhythms, the fills, mm-hmm. everything was played by Clive. So playing live is a little tricky, and Alex has been working with us, Alex Kerran. to fill in there.
Well, obviously, Tony and Billy are living in America. How easy or difficult is it going to be for live gigs?
It's going to be difficult, but we haven't put a cross on it. We've spoken to Billy about this and Tony about this, and it's just about logistics, really. You know, how are we going to do it? When do we want to do it? We've also talked about another album. We've talked about doing that one in LA. So, you know, it's all doable, but it's not like the old days where you all had to be sitting in the same town to be able to create a band.
No.
The world is a lot smaller now.
Do you think then that the modern technology has probably been very helpful in bringing Mabel Greer's Toy Shop back together again?
Yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with the final version of the album. However, before we even got Billy and Tony involved, all of the demos that we put together, they were done in Paris in one single studio with just the three of us, Hugo, Clive and myself. Those turned out pretty good too, and those are the ones we sent to Billy and Tony and said, look, this is what we've been doing, guys, do you want to get involved? And they were blown away by it. So we've also got another session, another version of that album called The Paris Tapes, if you like.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm sure that will probably find its way out sooner or later.
I know it will.
These things have a habit of appearing somewhere down the line, don't they?
They absolutely do, but, you know, we were very proud of it, and I think it's worthy of another album at some point.
So whose idea was it to approach Tony and Billy then? Because obviously Tony and Billy have a very good history with Yes. I mean, Tony's been in and out the band a few times over the years.
I think the thing is, I'm a great lover of the Hammond organ. You know, Keith Emerson and Tony are my heroes there.
Yeah.
And when we were putting the album together in Paris, you know, the one thing that stood out was that we needed some keyboards on there. We did a little bit. Hugo added some keyboards on, but from a keyboard standpoint, you know, Hugo is not Tony Kaye.
No.
So obviously, the first port of call was let's get a hold of Tony, and I didn't know how to do that because it's been a long time.
Yeah.
But Billy Sherwood is very, you know, available and such a great guy. I got a hold of Billy and told him what we were trying to do, and he set the whole thing up for us.
Of course, because Billy is in a band with Tony called Circa, so it's it's a lot easier to make the contact. With regards Mabel Greer's Toy Shop, the sort of latter days, I mean, you left and Bill Bruford came in, but was Tony Kaye a part of the setup then? Because it all gets a little bit murky with so much coming and going with the lineup of the band. Did you actually play with Tony Kaye, or was he after your time in the band?
He came in at the time I left.
Right.
Clive carried on and played with Tony and Bill, but I mean, effectively when I left, that was in June '68. That's when Tony and Bill Bruford came in together, and that I think was when Peter came back as well. The three of them came back as I left, so you know, that's where the big change happened. Well,
let's look at the album. There's 11 tracks on the album. There are 6 tracks that, if people know anything about Mabel Greer's Toy Shop, and it always amazes me actually how many people know so much about the band, but there's 6 tracks on there that people would recognise from your live set, at least, of the sort of time that you were playing in the band in 1968.
Yep, those are the ones that appeared on the John Peel radio show Night Ride, and I think there's a couple of demos floating around as well of Beyond and Before and Electric Funeral that we did with Mike Leander of MCA Records at the time.
Right.
So I think there's a bit of a mix. But yeah, there was no album actually released. In fact, the first Yes album didn't come out till 1969, if I remember correctly.
That's right. And that featured Sweetness and Beyond and Before, of course.
Yeah.
How was it for you then, sort of tackling these songs? It must, in some ways, it must have been quite daunting. And yet in other ways, it's I suppose, you have a clean sheet. You can almost do what you like with them.
Right, and I would have liked to, John, but I didn't. You know, the memory cells kicked in, and you know, we only played those songs 2 or 3 times in the studio, and the next thing we knew, the tapes were already laid down, and we were progressing and moving on.
Yeah. And
I was still very rusty, and you know, when I listened back to it, I would have loved to have done something different, but unfortunately, I just did what the memory cells told me to do.
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. It sounds great. I've got to be honest, it's a really, really good sounding album. Now let's look at the newer material, because it's all good and well having Mabel Greer's Toy Shop out there, and there's a lot of old material on the album, but really, if you're going to be a proper band, you need new material, don't you?
Well, new material is the last of our problems. In fact, trying to contain Clive with writing new stuff is the biggest problem we've got. We sit down in a rehearsal and try to go over some of the album stuff, and the next thing we know, he's saying this is something I wrote last night, and it's absolutely brilliant. He's got some amazing amazing compositions in the can, just waiting to go. So I think we could, if we wanted to and had the logistical time available, we could probably put something down in just a couple of weeks. There's just so much material there.
Do you think the dam's burst then with Clive?
Oh, with Clive, the dam has definitely burst. Keeping up with him is another story.
Well, the thing about the album is that obviously it's going to appeal to a lot of Yes fans. So you in many ways, you're quite lucky, really, because you have an audience that is going to want to hear this, and also the potential of acquiring a new audience. So it must be quite exciting for you.
Yeah, I think there is a new audience because Yes have completely moved on from those days, those 60s and 70s sounds, and they've got a great band right now, but it's nothing like what it was in the 60s and 70s. And we've kind of taken that as a reference point, as a starting point, if you like. So developing on away from there, it's going to take the band in a completely different direction. There's no question about that.
Well, the album was recorded last year. You've had some time to live with it. How do you feel about it now?
Yeah, I think that the energy and the vibe that we created was unique in that probably because we didn't put much preparation into it. We just sat down and played it. I think the next one is going to be more sophisticated. It can't help but be because we've just, sort of been through a period of experiencing what it's like to put stuff together again and play in a studio again. So it will be different. I think that's my major reflection, is that it's unique, and as much as I would have liked to have done differently on the album, we would have probably ruined it if we had, because of that time capsule, that capture that we managed to do.
So 50 years on from the formation of Mabel Greer's Toy Shop.
49, John, don't exaggerate.
Well, it's almost 50 years. The thing is, the band, it's looking better than ever. There's probably even more potential than there was in 1966, 68.
There is potential. We'll have to see about that, yep.